I still remember the sound that changed everything. It wasn't a gunshot. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't even someone screaming. It was the deep metallic groan of a steel barrier dropping across a narrow private boat lane, followed by complete silence. The kind of silence that lasts only a heartbeat before absolute chaos explodes. 1 second a line of expensive boats was gliding toward a luxury floating lodge packed with wealthy guests, and the next they were drifting helplessly in circles, horns blaring, engines idling, people standing up with drinks still in their hands wondering why the only access route had suddenly disappeared. If you've ever wondered what happens when a homeowners association mistakes confidence for ownership and pushes the wrong landowner too far, stick around. Because this story still divides people in my county to this day. My name is Grant Holloway, and until a couple of years ago, I lived a quiet life on Cedar Hollow Reservoir, a place where mornings smelled like wet pine and coffee, afternoons belonged to fishermen, and evenings ended with the kind of sunsets that made people forget to look at their phones. My family had owned the shoreline on the Western Cove since my great-grandfather bought it after returning from World War II. Back then there weren't any luxury homes, no gated communities, no waterfront developments. Just a handful of cabins, a gravel road, and neighbors who believed a handshake meant something. The old boat ramp on my property wasn't fancy. It had weathered concrete, cedar rails my father rebuilt 3 different times, and a steel dock that squeaked every spring after the ice melted. But it worked, and for decades, if someone needed help launching a fishing boat because the public ramp across the lake was crowded, we'd let them through. Not because we had to, because that's what decent people did. My dad used to tell me, son, kindness works only when people remember it's a gift, not an obligation. I never really understood what he meant until I met Vanessa Caldwell. Vanessa didn't arrive like most newcomers. She arrived with architects, consultants, branding experts, and enough confidence to convince strangers she already owned half the county. She bought the old Hillcrest Lodge on the opposite shoreline and announced a project she proudly called the future of Cedar Hollow. According to the glossy brochures that started appearing in every mailbox, she planned to build a floating dining pavilion, luxury event space, private marina, wine deck, an upscale recreational district that would, in her words, transform an underused lake into a world-class destination. Those words sounded impressive to people who didn't actually live there. To the folks who had spent their lives around that water, it sounded like someone describing a completely different place. At first, I honestly tried to give her the benefit of the doubt. Progress isn't always a bad thing. Small towns need business. Local kids need jobs. Maybe she really wanted to invest in the community. Maybe all the expensive suits and polished speeches were just part of being successful. Then one Saturday morning, I walked down to my dock carrying a cup of coffee and stopped halfway down the hill. 3 men wearing bright safety vests were standing on my property, measuring the width of my boat ramp, photographing my retaining wall, and marking the ground with orange paint. I thought maybe they were lost. "Morning," I called out. "Can I help you fellas?" The oldest one barely glanced up before answering, just collecting measurements for the waterfront access improvement project. I frowned. Waterfront access for who? Before he could answer, another familiar voice floated across the gravel. "Mr. Holloway." Perfect timing. Vanessa stepped out of a black SUV wearing sunglasses that probably cost more than my first pickup truck. She smiled the way politicians smile during election season, warm enough to look friendly, calculated enough to hide every real intention. I was actually hoping we'd run into each other. I looked from her to the survey crew. "Why are they on my property?" She gestured toward my boat ramp as casually as if she were pointing at a public sidewalk. We're evaluating traffic flow for future community access improvements. I laughed because I honestly thought she was joking. Community access. This ramp belongs to my family. She tilted her head slightly, almost amused by my response. Well, technically that's one interpretation. My smile disappeared. Excuse me. She folded her hands together like a teacher explaining something to a stubborn student. Your family has allowed public use for decades. Continuous community access creates expectations. Expectations eventually become recognized community interests. I'd heard plenty of nonsense in my life, but that one deserved a trophy. So let me get this straight, I said. You're telling me that because my father helped neighbors launch fishing boats for free, you think that somehow transferred ownership to your development? She chuckled softly. Not ownership, Grant. Stewardship. That single word irritated me more than if she'd yelled. Stewardship. Funny how people invent elegant words when they're trying to take something that isn't theirs. I stepped between her and the survey markers. This conversation is over. Take your people off my land. For just a split second, the polished smile disappeared. It wasn't anger exactly. It was annoyance. The expression of someone unaccustomed to hearing the word no. She nodded toward the workers. Let's go. We have enough information for today. As they drove away, I noticed something that stayed with me all afternoon. One of the surveyors quietly slipped an orange flag into the ground near the old boundary marker my grandfather installed more than 70 years earlier. That wasn't an accident. They weren't measuring. They were planning. The next few weeks felt like watching weeds spread across a healthy garden. HOA newsletters started referring to my private ramp as the West Community Access Corridor. Visitors unfamiliar with the area began asking if permits were required to launch from what they believed was public property. New signs appeared near the entrance road directing resort guests toward my shoreline. One afternoon, I watched a retired school teacher named Helen Parker pull into my driveway looking completely embarrassed. Grant, she said, they told me at the Welcome Center I had to pay $30 to launch my little fishing boat here. $30, I asked. She nodded. They said the Homeowners Association now manages lake access. My stomach tightened. Nobody had the authority to charge anyone for using my property because nobody but me owned it. I walked down to the ramp and found two college kids sitting behind a folding table with a portable card reader, collecting launch fees under a banner printed with the logo of Vanessa's development company. They looked nervous the moment they saw me. Sir, one of them began, we're just volunteers. I held up my hand. I know this isn't your idea. Who told you to sit here? Ms. Caldwell. She said the association approved everything. I looked around at the families waiting with their boats, some already pulling out credit cards, others simply assuming this must all be legitimate. That's when I realized the real danger wasn't the money, it was repetition. Tell a lie often enough, dress it up with matching shirts, official-looking signs, and enough confident smiles, and eventually ordinary people stop asking questions. They simply accept the new version of reality because everyone else seems to believe it too. I packed up the table, folded the banner, handed the confused volunteers their cooler, and politely told every waiting family they didn't owe anyone a dime. Some thanked me. Others looked suspicious, unsure who was telling the truth. As the last truck pulled away, I stood alone beside the water watching the ripples spread across the lake. My father had been right all those years ago. Kindness really does work only as long as people remember it's a gift. The moment someone mistakes generosity for surrender, everything changes. And although I didn't know it yet, Vanessa Caldwell had already decided she wasn't interested in borrowing my goodwill anymore. She intended to own the shoreline itself. Grant me one thing. Don't picture this as a fight that exploded overnight. The truth is, the worst battles almost never begin with shouting. They begin with paperwork, quiet conversations behind closed doors, and people convincing themselves that if they move fast enough, nobody will notice what's disappearing until it's already gone. Looking back now, I can point to the exact morning I realized Vanessa Caldwell wasn't simply overconfident. She was executing a plan. 3 days after I removed her fee table, I drove into town for breakfast at Miller's Cafe, the kind of place where every waitress knows your order before you sit down. I had barely poured cream into my coffee when old Ray Donnelly, who spent 40 years working for the county assessor's office, slid into the booth across from me without asking. Ray wasn't the type to spread gossip. If he spoke quietly, it usually meant something mattered. "Grant," he said, stirring his coffee even though he drank it black, "you've got somebody pulling copies of your property records." I looked up. "Who?" He shrugged. "Can't tell you names, but somebody's been requesting old surveys, shoreline easements, tax plats, even the original subdivision maps from the late 40s. A strange weight settled in my chest. Nobody digs through 70-year-old property archives unless they're looking for a way around something. Ray leaned closer. "Just thought you'd want to know." That afternoon I drove straight to the courthouse. The clerk behind the records counter smiled when she saw me. "Back again?" she asked. "Apparently," I answered. I spent nearly 3 hours going through maps my grandfather probably hadn't looked at since Harry Truman was president. Every deed matched what I'd always known. Every survey confirmed the same boundary. Every legal description placed the entire western ramp, retaining wall, shoreline, and submerged approach inside my family's property. Nothing had changed, on paper, but as every engineer knows, facts don't stop people from trying. On the drive home, I noticed something new: fresh stakes, bright orange ribbon, small numbered markers running along the edge of the access road. They hadn't been there yesterday. I parked my truck and followed them until I reached the old stone monument that marked the original corner of our parcel. Somebody had dug around it, not deep enough to remove it, just enough to expose it. Fresh shovel marks, loose dirt, boot prints. Whoever had done it wanted to know exactly where that monument sat. Standing there, I suddenly remembered Vanessa's smile when she'd said, "Technically, that's one interpretation." No, she wasn't questioning history. She was searching for a loophole big enough to drive an entire commercial development through. 2 mornings later, the noise started. At first I thought somebody was cutting timber across the reservoir. Then I heard diesel engines, big ones. By the time I reached the shoreline, 2 construction barges were already pushing steel pontoons across the water while cranes unloaded beams the size of railroad tracks. Workers moved with military precision. Welders sparked. Generators hummed. It looked less like a lakeside project and more like an offshore oil platform. I walked directly toward the foreman. "Morning," I said. "Who authorized construction through my ramp?" He checked his clipboard without even looking at me. "Access approved by Cedar Point Residential Association." "Approved by who?" "Association president." "That's interesting," I replied, "because association presidents don't own this property." The man finally looked up. You could tell immediately he wasn't trying to cause trouble. He was just doing the job he'd been hired to do. "Sir," he sighed, "we've got permits." "Mind if I see them?" He hesitated before handing me a copy. I only needed about 30 seconds to spot the first problem. The permit referenced shoreline improvement, not commercial marine construction. It mentioned temporary floating structures, not a 2-story restaurant with permanent utility hookups. Even worse, the property description stopped almost 40 feet short of where the barges were sitting. I handed the papers back. "These permits don't authorize what you're building." Before the foreman could answer, a familiar voice interrupted. "They authorize exactly what they need to authorize." Vanessa walked across the temporary dock wearing a cream-colored coat that somehow managed to stay spotless despite the mud everywhere else. "Grant," she said pleasantly, still resisting progress. "Progress doesn't usually require trespassing." She smiled for the workers, making sure they all saw how calm she remained. "You really should attend more HOA meetings." I couldn't help laughing. "Vanessa, I don't live in your subdivision." "No," she replied, "but your property affects it." "My property affects birds too. That doesn't give them voting rights." A couple of workers smirked before quickly looking away. Vanessa's smile tightened. She hated being laughed at. "You're making this harder than it has to be." "Funny," I answered. "I was just thinking the same thing." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Do you honestly believe one man can stop a project this large?" I looked past her toward the growing steel platform stretching farther into the reservoir every hour. "No," I admitted, "but I do think one deed can." Her expression changed for just a fraction of a second. Not fear. Calculation. She realized I wasn't bluffing. That evening, Sheriff Nathan Briggs pulled into my driveway. Nathan and I had known each other since high school football. He removed his hat before walking onto the porch, which told me this wasn't a visit he wanted to make. "Grant," he sighed, "I've got 2 formal complaints." "Let me guess." "Harassment, obstruction, interference with approved community improvements." I leaned against the porch railing. "Did Vanessa tell you she charged people to use my private ramp?" Nathan rubbed the back of his neck. "She mentioned maintenance fees." "Did she mention she doesn't own an inch of that shoreline?" Silence answered louder than words. Finally he said, "Off the record, this thing's getting political." "Property lines aren't political." "Maybe not," he replied quietly, "but wealthy developers usually find people willing to pretend they are." After he left, I couldn't sleep. Around midnight, I walked down to the dock carrying a flashlight. The construction lights glowed across the reservoir like a second sunrise. Music echoed over the water. Welders kept working long after dark. Somebody was spending a fortune trying to finish that floating restaurant before anyone could stop it. That's when I noticed another light moving near my shoreline. Small, flashing. I crouched behind an old cedar tree and watched 2 figures kneel beside the original boundary monument. One held a flashlight while the other measured something with a tape. Then, unbelievably, they drove a fresh wooden stake several feet away from the original marker. They weren't surveying anymore. They were creating confusion. The next morning, I photographed everything before pulling the fake stake out of the ground. Less than an hour later, Vanessa herself appeared at my gate. She didn't bother pretending to be friendly this time. "You removed survey equipment," she said coldly. "No," I answered. "I removed fiction. You're interfering with a legal boundary review." "There isn't a legal boundary review." "How do you know?" I held up the county survey map I'd picked up the previous afternoon. "Because I asked the county." For the first time since this whole mess began, she completely lost her composure. "You think paperwork is going to save you," she snapped. "I think truth usually does." We stared at each other for several long seconds. Finally, she smiled again. But this smile felt different. It wasn't confident anymore. It was dangerous. "You'll regret embarrassing me," she said softly. Then she climbed back into her SUV and drove away. Watching the dust settle behind her tires, I realized something that honestly should have frightened me more than it did. People like Vanessa don't measure success by what they build. They measure it by what they control. And once someone like that feels control slipping away, they stop worrying about fairness. They start worrying about winning, at any cost. I had no idea just how expensive that attitude was about to become. Because within 48 hours I was going to uncover a document that would expose her entire operation, and once I saw it, there would be no peaceful way back for either of us. Grant me one last stretch of your time, because this is where everything finally came into focus. Up until then, I thought I was fighting over a boat ramp. a property line, maybe even a stubborn HOA president with an oversized ego. I was wrong. What I was really fighting was the idea that if someone has enough money, enough lawyers, enough polished presentations, and enough people repeating the same lie, eventually reality will simply give up. Reality doesn't work that way. It just takes patience to catch up. The morning after Vanessa warned me I'd regret embarrassing her, I drove back to the county courthouse before sunrise. The record's clerk looked surprised to see me again, but she pointed me toward the public terminals without asking questions. I started digging through every permit connected to Cedar Point's waterfront project. At first everything looked ordinary, almost too ordinary. Then I noticed the approval dates. Environmental reviews that normally took months had supposedly been completed in 2 days. Shoreline impact reports were marked as not required. Even stranger, the floating restaurant had been classified as a temporary recreational platform instead of a permanent commercial structure. That alone made my stomach tighten. Then I opened the business registration. I stared at the screen for several seconds before reading it again just to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The registered operating address for the floating restaurant wasn't Cedar Point. It wasn't Hillcrest Lodge. It was my property, 841 Hollow Creek Road, my house, my land. Someone had literally filed a commercial business under my address without my knowledge. I printed every page the courthouse would let me print and drove straight to attorney Evelyn Harper. Evelyn had represented ranchers, farmers, and timber families for almost 30 years. She read quietly, turning pages slower and slower until she finally leaned back in her chair. "Grant," she said, "this isn't a neighborhood disagreement anymore." "I was afraid you'd say that." She tapped the registration papers. "Unauthorized commercial registration, questionable permits, potential lending fraud if these filings were used for financing. If everything here checks out, she's standing on very thin ice." I handed her my original deed and the old shoreline survey. Evelyn spread them across her conference table beside the construction plans. Her finger followed one line, then another. Suddenly she smiled. "Well now, what? Do you know what riparian rights are?" I nodded. "Generally." "Not generally," she replied. "Specifically." She traced the underwater boundary extending beyond my shoreline. "Your family's ownership doesn't stop where the water begins. A portion of the lake bed belongs to you." My heartbeat slowed instead of speeding up. Calm has a funny way of arriving when uncertainty disappears. "Meaning?" I asked. "Meaning if that restaurant is anchored over this section." She looked directly at me. "She isn't just using your ramp. She's built part of her business on your property." By noon, we had hired an independent marine surveyor named Daniel Cross. Daniel spent the afternoon mapping underwater anchor locations with sonar and GPS equipment while I watched from my dock. Around 4 o'clock, he climbed back into his boat wearing the biggest grin I'd seen all week. "Grant," he called, holding up his tablet, "you're going to want to see this." The restaurant's primary anchor system extended nearly 15 feet inside my submerged property boundary. Every heavy anchor holding that million-dollar structure in place rested on land my family legally owned. Daniel looked at me and laughed softly. "I've surveyed lakes for 25 years. I've never seen anyone build something this expensive without checking where they were putting it." That evening, Evelyn filed for an emergency injunction while I did something much simpler. I called Carson Industrial Fabrication. 48 hours later, a black hydraulic security gate stood across my private launch lane, anchored into reinforced concrete with enough steel to stop a bulldozer. It wasn't built out of anger. It was built to establish one thing: boundaries. Saturday arrived with bright blue skies, warm sunshine, and exactly the kind of weather Vanessa had been advertising for months. Luxury boats lined up outside the floating restaurant. Valets waved guests toward my ramp. Live music drifted across the reservoir. Champagne glasses sparkled in the afternoon light. Standing on my deck, remote control in my hand, I almost felt sorry for what was about to happen. Almost. At precisely 5 o'clock I pressed the button. The hydraulic motor hummed. The steel gate lowered, boats stopped, confusion spread, horns echoed across the water, people began shouting from every direction. Within minutes Vanessa's SUV came flying down the access road. She jumped out before the vehicle had completely stopped. "Grant," she yelled, "open that gate right now." I calmly slipped the remote into my pocket. "Why? You're blocking customers." "No," I answered. "I'm protecting private property. This access belongs to the community. Show me the deed." She pointed toward the growing crowd. "People paid thousands to attend tonight. They paid you." Her face turned crimson. "I'll have you arrested." "You're welcome to try." As if someone had timed it perfectly, Sheriff Nathan Briggs pulled in behind her. Vanessa rushed toward him before he even closed his truck door. "Sheriff, he's sabotaging my business." Nathan looked at me. "Grant." Without saying a word, I handed him the original deed, Daniel's marine survey, and Evelyn's injunction paperwork. He spent nearly 2 minutes reading everything while the entire shoreline waited in silence. Finally, he closed the folder and turned toward Vanessa. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "this ramp is private." She blinked. "No, it isn't." "Yes," he replied, "it is." "Then make him open it." Nathan shook his head. "I can't order a property owner to surrender his property." You could actually hear people whispering behind us. Investors looked confused. Guests started checking their phones. One elderly man asked loudly, "So we've been using somebody else's land this whole time?" Nobody answered him because nobody could. The truth had already done the talking. 3 nights later, my security cameras recorded 2 people trying to cut through the hydraulic control cables. They never made it past the protective conduit. When deputies reviewed the footage the next morning, one figure was clearly identifiable: Vanessa Caldwell. That single recording became the final piece investigators needed. The following week, search warrants were issued for Cedar Point's financial records. Investigators uncovered falsified environmental filings, unauthorized HOA loans, forged meeting minutes, and contractor invoices tied to permits that had never legally existed. What started as a property dispute unraveled into something much larger. The floating restaurant closed before it ever officially opened. Investors disappeared almost overnight. Banks froze funding. Contractors packed their equipment and left. A month later, the court ordered the structure removed from the reservoir. I stood beside Daniel and Evelyn as cranes slowly lifted the massive floating building from the water. Without the anchors buried in my property, it looked strangely helpless, like something that had mistaken borrowed support for permanent strength. As the last section disappeared behind a line of trees, the reservoir grew quiet again. Birds returned. Fishermen launched before sunrise without anyone demanding a fee. Families gathered at the shoreline the way they always had. Even Sheriff Briggs stopped by one evening carrying 2 fishing poles and a cooler. We sat on the dock until sunset without talking much. Sometimes silence says everything that needs saying. Before he left, he smiled and said, "Funny thing about the truth. It doesn't mind waiting." I smiled back. "No, but people usually do." Looking across Cedar Hollow today, you'd never guess how close this place came to losing itself. The old cedar rails still creak every spring. My father's dock still needs fresh stain every summer. Kids still wave when they idle past in aluminum fishing boats. And every time I unlock that gate for a neighbor who simply asks first, I remember something my grandfather used to say. Land isn't really what you're protecting. You're protecting the promise that honesty still matters somewhere. Maybe that's the real lesson in all of this. Property lines can be surveyed. Buildings can be removed. HOAs can rise and fall. But once people start believing confidence is the same thing as truth, communities begin disappearing long before anyone notices. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you were standing where I stood, would you have lowered that gate, or would you have handled it differently? Do you think Vanessa believed she was helping the community, or was it always about power and control? Share your thoughts in the comments because these conversations matter, and every perspective adds something valuable. If stories about standing your ground, protecting what's right, and watching justice unfold mean something to you, don't forget to like, subscribe, and join me for the next story. You never know which quiet little town has the next unbelievable fight waiting just beneath the surface.